So please join me in welcoming Alyson.
Thank you, Polly, and thanks for being here today. I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces in the audience, and I really appreciate you coming to see our presentation. As Polly mentioned, I'm a snowbird here in Green Valley from Charlottesville, Virginia. My husband and I 2 years ago came and rented a small house here in Green Valley, and we were here for 7 weeks, and before we left, we had purchased a house. So that was 2 years ago, and here we are. That's coming on now. So as Polly mentioned, I'm a volunteer in Charlottesville with the International Rescue Committee, and in Charlottesville, we resettle about 200 refugees every year. Part of my work as a volunteer is to go out to the community and do an outreach with people and talk about refugees and tell how we resettle, how are the refugees selected overseas, and how do they come to the States, and how do they get resettled in Charlottesville. And when I first came to Green Valley, and I was here in Tucson and Green Valley and Nogales, I thought, wouldn't it be great to have a presentation that mimics that refugee presentation but has to do with immigration in general? So this is the result of 2 years of my own research and study on what is our immigration system. And it's not going to be trying to convince you of anything. I'm not trying to give you any point of view. I'm trying to give you a background. There's lots of things going on, and a lot of you are very involved in immigration here, and there's a lot of experts in the room, I realize. This is really the background upon which hopefully it can be the context within which you can learn other things and see other things. So we're going to go very quickly through this presentation. It's about 45 minutes. This is our agenda. We're going to talk about the heart of the matter, which is our visitors and our citizens. We're going to take a look at Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice. We're going to talk about unauthorized residents a bit. I'm going to give you just a snapshot of some things in Arizona that you may or may not be aware of, and then talk a little bit about what you can do, and also there's a handout in the back of the room that talks about things that you can do if you want to learn more. So this is quite small print, so I'll read some of it, but the heart of the matter really is 2 questions, and these are the questions that we have to ask ourselves as citizens. One is, who can come to the United States? Who can visit us? And the other question is, who can become a citizen? So this is the heart of everything we're doing and everything we're talking about. Now what we have here is a list of some of the historic things. This is just a partial list of some of the historic laws that were enacted. You probably remember the Chinese Exclusion Act, where we decided we wanted no more Chinese here in the States. In 1917, we had an Immigration Act that that gave us literacy tests as part of coming to the United States. We also, this is the first travel ban, barred people from Asia, all the way from Turkey, all the way through Indonesia. So all of Asia was banned from coming to the United States in 1917. In 1924, this was a big, big law, because what it did was it gave us national origins quotas. What we said was, we're going to allow people to come to the United States in the same percentage as our current population. At that point, we said, really, we want only people who are white. We ignored our African American population in this. We ignored our Native American population, and we ignored the Mexicans as far as these numbers. So this was a bit of a racist law. We also started requiring visas for people to enter the country. In 1965, this was another big one, the Immigration and Naturalization Act. We started putting family preferences and skills at the top of the list. We would start to allow people only if they were related to family members here or had certain skills, but we also started to put caps on countries. And we also then at the same time broadened geography. Now in the next slide, you're gonna see what happened to that geographic scope of our immigrant population. We also started temporary visas in 1965, like travel visas, business visas, etc. So that's the first question at the heart of the matter, is who can come to the United States? The second question, who can become a citizen? We're gonna just take a quick snapshot of the history there. Early on, we decided that anyone who was a free white person could be a citizen as long as they had lived here for 2 years. In 1802, we passed a law that said all immigrants can become citizens. They would come to the States, they would report and register, and after they lived here 5 years, they could then become a citizen. We all probably have learned here that in 1848 and 1854, at the end of the Mexican-American War, people who were Mexicans could opt to stay here in the States as citizens, and many did. And that happened at the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, as well as at the Gadsden Purchase, where we are today as the Gadsden Purchase. In 1868, we passed the 14th Amendment. This has been in the news quite a bit recently. So in 1868, we passed the 14th Amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the U.S. are citizens. Now, this was passed just after the Civil War, and it was basically targeted at African Americans, allowing those African Americans to become citizens. But what that did is it put us into this jus soli, which means the right of the soil. At that point, we decided that as a country, we would allow people who are born here to become citizens. Mostly, if you look at the world, you see that the Western Hemisphere has this as the basis of their law. We needed people to come here, and we allowed people who had children born here for those children to become citizens automatically. Most of the rest of the world, historically, has been the other choice, the right of the blood, which means I am what my parents are. It has no bearing where I've been born. Recently, these have changed. Some European countries have realized it's not in their best interest to have people like, for example, in Germany, there's a huge Turkish population. It doesn't do them any good to have generation after generation of Turks living in their country when they are speaking German, but they're not able to become citizens. So people in Europe are starting to change from this jus sanguinis, which is right of the blood, to right of the soil, to be more like us. And of course, in 1940, the Native Americans became citizens here. So again, this is the heart of the matter, where we're thinking about who can come to the States and who can become a citizen. Early on, anyone who came could become a citizen. Later on, things changed and we got more restrictive as time went on. Now let's go back to this 1965, because we're going to look more closely at the immigration population. So this chart compares 1960 to 2015, and you can see how many immigrants there were in 1960 and 2015, from 9.7 million to 43.2 million. And this is a percent of our total population. So again, it went from 5.4% of our population to 13.4%. Now when I say immigrant, for the purposes of this presentation, I mean anybody who was not born in this country. This could be somebody who was not born here but has become a naturalized citizen. This could be somebody who was not born here but has a green card to live here. This could be somebody who was not born here but has come here to study for a temporary time, or this could be someone who's undocumented and living here. But notice how this changes. Blue is Europe. Notice how much more diversified our immigrant population has become over time because of that 1965 law that changed who could come here. So this is Europe, this is Asia, Latin America, and Mexico is this yellow. And you can see how much more diversified we are in 2015. So we're gonna go back to the heart of the matter, and there's an awful lot of information on this chart. We're gonna spend a little bit of time on this now. We're gonna think really in two categories. We have people who are temporary visitors, and we have people who have a pathway to citizenship. And beneath this, there are dozens of visas and laws that pertain to these, but we've just picked out some as, for examples here so that you can see. The temporary visitors, approximately 9.6 or 10 million people are temporary visitors to the US every year. You've probably heard that we have travel visas and business visas. These might be 10-year multi-visit visas. They're issued to people all over the world. We have some people coming in with visas for student or exchange visas, almost 1 million of those. You've probably heard of the specialty worker visa. These are time-bound visas for people to come here with special skill sets. And then we have the temporary protected status. Now these are people who have been in a foreign country and they faced a natural disaster or a war, and it's been deemed unsafe for them to stay in those countries, and we've given them refuge. And throughout the last 20 or 30 years, we have different countries. Later on, we'll see a list of these countries that have this temporary protected status. And then you've heard of DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. These are people who've come to the States, probably with their parents. They are not citizens of the US, but they've been raised here because they've come as children. And Obama signed an executive order that said, we're gonna give these people a chance to live here and work here and go to school and get driver's licenses for a 2-year time frame. And at the end of that 2 years, they can re-sign up for another 2 years. That's how DACA works. And of course, as you know, one of the debates we're having now is whether that was a legal thing for Obama to do. And Trump has tried to shut that down, and this is something that will be headed to the Supreme Court soon, this decision about whether we have a program and we can continue the program of DACA, or it needs to be shut down. So these are temporary visitors, and by and large, anybody who's on this side of this chart, with few exceptions, and those are the 1Bs and a couple of these worker visas, there's no way for anybody here to move over here and have a pathway to citizenship. One way they might do that is to marry someone who's a US citizen and get a visa that allows them to be a fiancé visa. But by and large, this is pretty much of a wall here. And if you come in on one of these visas, you then can't have a pathway to citizenship. So let's look on the pathway to citizenship side. Remember that the 1965 law gave preference for families. So what you see on the right-hand side, about 1 million people a year becomes US citizens or have been given the right to be a US citizen. So these are people who've been sitting outside this country and they're on a list and they're waiting for their number to come up. Maybe the Philippines and the Mexicans are a 20-year wait. Some of these countries have very long waits at this to get one of these family visas that allow them to come here, be here for about a year, and then turn that into a green card or legal permanent residence as an option to become a citizen. So most of our people come in this way. EB work permits are economic-based work permits. These are people with very high skills, very high education, and in some cases, this EB work permits are given to people who have invested in the US. So, for example, I just read the other day that there's a wait list of the EB5, which is the investment of 19,000 Chinese are on that list waiting to come in. If they can come in with a $500,000 investment and buy a company or make an investment, then they have a right to come to the States, and then there's a pathway to citizenship. You may have heard the diversity lottery in the news. Again, this is a pathway to citizenship. The US decided that we didn't have enough diversity among our people and among our immigrants. So there's a list of countries that are underrepresented here in the US. And every year we allow 50,000 people to come in. These are people who have lived overseas. They've put their name in the lottery. There's a very thorough vetting of these people, and then they come in with a specific visa. They convert that to a green card, and they have the option to become a citizen later on. Now, this is the refugees, another controversial area. This year, Obama signed the executive order that said that we would allow 30,000 refugees to come to the States every year. Did I say Obama?
Yeah.
Sorry. That was wishful thinking.
Yeah.
Trump signed that. When Obama was president, we had it up to about 110,000. But last year, I think we had 45,000 was the limit. Only 22,000 actually made it into the country. These are people throughout the world. The United Nations says there are about 20 million people who are refugees. These are people who are not living in their home country. They fear persecution or have been persecuted back in their home country. They cannot return home. And these are based on religion or race. These are human-based persecution issues. And we have 20 million people in the world now that fit this category. And there are another 40 million who are internally displaced persons within their own country that also cannot go home, but they're not deemed refugees because they're not living outside of their home country. So based on this, we as a nation have signed a the UN Refugee Convention that says we're going to take so many refugees every year, and the president gets to decide how many. In this year, we are targeting 30,000. So these people get vetted overseas. It's about an 18 to 20 month vetting process to ensure that A, they are refugees, B, that they're not going to be harmful to us, and then they come and they're resettled. Right now, we're taking mostly people from the Congo, Bhutan, those are the Nepal. We get a lot of people from Nepal coming as refugees. The special immigrant visa is an interesting case. We only get people from 2 countries in the special immigrant visa. One is Iraq and the other is Afghanistan. Any place, those 2 places where the US has been in military action, and we have translators and other people who work with government officials, and we're giving them refuge here because for them to stay in their home countries would be quite dangerous. So we have about 16,000 of those. And asylees, this is a new category and also one we're talking about quite a bit in the news as well. An asylee is similar to a refugee, but their location is different. So refugees are all vetted overseas. They live overseas, we vet them overseas, and then they're given permission to come here. Asylees have come to our country and they're standing on our soil and they're asking for asylum. They end up, in many cases, being treated similarly to the refugees with regard to benefits, sometimes not, but often they are. And you hear sometimes basketball players or people from Russia coming here and they're here with a team and then they ask for asylum. The same thing is happening, of course, on our southern border. People are coming from the south and they're coming north and they want to get to our soil and ask for asylum. So these are asylees, so very low numbers coming in. So again, just to kind of summarize this chart, we have people here temporarily, and then we have people who have a pathway to citizenship, and all of the laws that are sort of the background to our how we can do things are going to tell us how many people can come in each category from each country. There are very specific numbers in many cases. The other important thing to know is that some of these things are codified in law. When you start to think, well, how can we make a change here? Some of these things are based in law and they must be passed by our United States Congress. And as we know, it's hard to get these people thinking along the same lines or having an agreement for these things. As we go down the list, we see other things that maybe take an executive order of the president. So DACA was something that Obama did with an executive order. He could not get the Congress to agree on this issue, so he wrote an executive order, and there's some debate whether he has had the right to do that and whether he should continue to have the right to, or whether Trump can have the right to continue to do this. Some states are suing Trump and saying he shouldn't allow for the DACA to continue. The same with temporary protected status. This was started as a law, but then it needed to have the signature of the president every year to continue, whether these people from these countries could stay here or whether they needed to go home. So we're going to see in a little bit that one of the problems is that the temporary protected status has not been signed by Trump, and so people who've been here for 20 years are expected to leave next year, and that too is under debate. We're going to turn quickly to the Department of Homeland Security. I've put, just for general purposes, the 2018 budget for the entire Department of Homeland Security. The three groups we're going to talk about briefly are these: Customs and Border Protection, ICE, and then the naturalization group. The other big Homeland Security groups are the Coast Guard and FEMA are the other big budgets, but you can see Customs and Border Protection and the ICE are over half of what Department of Homeland Security budgets include right now. So Customs and Border Protection are the people at the ports of entry. If you've ever gone down to Mexico and come back through Nogales, you would talk to those people. Also, if you were flying in from overseas, you would talk to Customs and Border Protection. They, of course, inspect our visitors. They talk to returning Americans, and they also inspect the cargo. Included in that is Border Patrol. This is the border agents between the ports of entry. So it's really two separate groups, and when you talk to them, they act like it's two separate groups too. They'll say, well, that's Customs and Border Protection. We don't really know about that. But the border agents are all between the ports of entry. Right now, there are about, in the Tucson sector, 4,200 border agents in our sector. Now, ICE is important throughout the country as well as here, but it operates across the U.S. and it manages detention centers. And it was only opened really after the Department of Homeland Security started. It's a new department, relatively speaking, 2003, but they now employ about 20,000 people and have 400 offices nationwide. This also includes what's called Enforcement and Removal Operations, ERO. And then the naturalization this is all the group within the government that naturalizes people. So on that previous chart, where we talked about the families becoming citizens, this is the group that vets the families right here. So what's important to us in Charlottesville, or someplace that's not really at the border, is how does the local sheriff and how do the local police cooperate with ICE? And I've just listed a number of ways that that's done. There's what's called the Secure Communities Program, and that's really federal databases. If I live in Charlottesville and I'm an undocumented individual, I don't have a driver's license. So as I drive around to my workplace or I go to drop my child off at school, I could be stopped at any time by the local police because I might have a headlight out or really for any reason. Now, if that happens 2 or 3 times, I'm taken to the local jail. And in the local jail, I'm probably going to be fingerprinted, and this is going to be beaten up against a database that's nationwide that tells whether I am or am not an undocumented person. So this is pretty much happening in all of our communities. We also have some communities that allow ICE to come in and check the jails for unauthorized detainees. And we also have what's called ICE detainers, which says that ICE might know that there's an unauthorized person in our jail, and they would request that the jail hold that detainee for longer than is really they should be held. If they were going to be released, say, on Monday morning at 8 o'clock, they might be asked, well, could you just keep that person till noon? We're going to come by at noon and pick them up. So that's called an ICE detainer. And this is the one that probably is the most, has gotten the most news recently, is this 287G, which is a part of our law that says that the local police or the local sheriff's department will be deputized and allowed to arrest people and talk to people with regard to immigration. Right now, immigration is a federal law, and so the local police and the local sheriffs have no jurisdiction over talking to people about their immigration status. They have no right to do that. But with these agreements, and there are about 78 agreements nationwide, with these agreements, there is training given by ICE for the local deputies and the local sheriffs in order to enforce immigration law in their local jurisdictions. So I'll show you in a bit how this plays out in Arizona. In this case, this tends to be quite costly for the local jurisdiction and quite controversial, but of course we don't really want this to be happening in Charlottesville. So a couple years ago I did some work in our Farmville Detention Center, which is about 2 hours away from Charlottesville. And this is a privately owned detention center, and many of the detention centers are privately owned, but I speak Spanish, so I went in and I did some what they call intake interviews. When new detainees would show up at the detention center, I would interview them and do about a 4-page interview to get basic demographic information from them and also information about their interaction with the police and all kinds of information so that the lawyers could look through it. The detention center situation is really, we have hundreds of facilities throughout the nation to hold detainees. Most of them are for-profit. This is statistics that the National Immigrant Justice Center put together from data that ICE had. About 71% of the detainees are held in privately operated facilities. These are for-profit facilities. Now, Obama signed an edict or an executive order that said he wanted to phase out using for-profit detention centers at all. But that was reversed recently. It costs, depending on the center, it could cost between $30 and $169 per day per inmate. So this is quite costly to the U.S. government, and I think some people here might even use a higher number than that. 2017, we had an average of 38,000 people in detention that were immigrants. In 2018, that went up to 39,000, and currently the average is over 44,000. So these numbers are going up. And I think in the current budgets that are going through the system, I don't know the exact number of beds, but I think they're asking for more beds than even this. And in this November 2017 data, when these detainees were characterized, 51% were non-criminal and they posed no threat. So these were literally people with no criminal backgrounds, no serious problems or history of criminalization or anything. ICE does set bond amounts, so some of these people can bond out. It's just the people who are putting you in jail are setting you bond. Sometimes that can be changed by a judge. So here's the Department of Justice, and what's interesting, I think, about this is that the immigration courts sit within the Department of Justice. They're not really a separate organization at all. Really, they have two questions that they ask themselves for each person. Is this person removable, and do they have any relief from removal? In other words, should we deport them, or is there some reason why they should have some relief from deportation? Immigration is a civil matter, so there's no required legal representation for all these people. So when I was doing the intake interviews, I knew that the people who were just recently arriving at the detention centers would not really have a chance to talk to lawyers ever. There would be pro bono lawyers that would be there to try to give them advice, but by and large, there are people who are pleading their own cases in front of the immigration judges. And in the case of Farmville is about 4 hours away from Arlington, the nearest immigration court. So this tended to happen on Skype. The interactions with the inmate and the judge. We have about 48 courts in the country with about 330 immigration judges. You know these numbers. We have over 700,000 backlog cases. Either they're in detention waiting, they're out on bond, or they're waiting and they're living on the economy. And then, of course, there's an appeals board. The Board of Immigration Appeals, the first step of appeals, also resides within the Department of Justice, and it's not until the next escalation of the court case does it go into the circuit courts or the Supreme Court. So you'll see cases going through the system that are going to the circuit courts and up to the Supreme Court as well. So we're on the last section here. Back to immigrants in general. As I mentioned, immigrants are foreign-born, so we have naturalized citizens. Those are U.S. citizens, and I think the only thing that a naturalized citizen can't do that you or I could do if we were born here was become the president of the United States, but by and large, it's the exact same. There's no pecking order here of citizens. Lawful permanent residents, this means green cards. These are people who've been vetted and who've gotten a green card, and it's at their option whether they want to become a naturalized citizen or not. And then temporary lawful residents, these are your student visas or your business visas. These are special categories. And then we have what I'm calling the unauthorized. Now you might hear the term undocumented or illegal alien. I use the term unauthorized resident. And the reason I like that is they're not undocumented. They do, in many cases, have documents. They just don't have the documents that authorize them to be living here. And I use the term resident because a lot of them have been here many, many years. So we're going to take our last section here and talk about these unauthorized. Again, we're going to look at 1990. And we're going to look at 2016, and you can see we started with 3.5 million, or 1% of the population was unauthorized in 1990, and here we are in 2016, 10.8 million, 11 million is generally the number that's thought of, and that's 3.3% of the population. Mexico is in blue, and it still remains the majority, although I had read an article recently that said that Mexico had dropped below 50% of all the unauthorized residents. Right now, more Mexicans are leaving the country than are coming into the country. Central America is this, pretty much stayed the same. This is Europe and Africa, this gray. This is the one that you can see a little uptick here. This gold is Asia, and then that blue is South America. So something that I didn't know before I did my study was that of the unauthorized residents that are here in the States, we have people who are border crossers, and we have people who are visa overstayers. And this second line is interesting. More overstayers have come in each year since 2007. More overstayers than border crossers. And if you look at the total, 58% of those unauthorized have entered without inspection. This is the official term. and 42 are visa overstayers. And that's why you saw that uptick of the Asians in part, because people were coming here for their education or for their work with their work visas and overstaying their visas. One of the debates, of course, we're having is about the border wall. I don't need to tell folks in this room, but it seems to me if we have statistics like this and we know them, the wall's not going to really affect at least 42% of those people. Maybe not even this side of the coin either. Unauthorized residents, just a few statistics. 2/3 have lived in the US 10 years or longer. 16 million people in the US live in mixed status families. These are families with some people who are unauthorized and others who are citizens. 16 million people. There are 200,000 mixed status marriages, and 4.7 million US citizen children have been born to unauthorized parents. It's something you don't think about. It's just based on the length of time that people have lived in this country with this status, either the temporary protected status, the unauthorized status, they've had children. These are US citizen children being born to the unauthorized. The more recent US immigration laws have started to focus on these unauthorized, and there are two that are quite significant. In 1986, Reagan helped enact a law called the Immigration Reform and Control Act. In that, he regularized about 3 million unauthorized people. This is, other people might say this is, he gave amnesty to these people. Now, this was a very controversial discussion at the time, but Reagan understood that it was not a good thing to have in this country people who were not being counted and they were not being treated as citizens. So he basically worked with the Congress and enacted two paths. One was agriculturally oriented and the other was just general. Not everyone took him up on his offer. Not everyone became a citizen. But at that time, about 3 million people had become citizens. And earlier in the 1900s, there were other waves of unauthorized being allowed to become citizens. And when I looked into this internationally, other countries also are giving people who are unauthorized a chance to become citizens or to have visas that allow them to stay and work and be productive citizens. The other thing that he did was he swung back around a year or two later and he wrote an executive action that allowed the children of the unauthorized to become citizens because, of course, in this amnesty, it didn't include the children. So he definitely included the children. And at that time, he also implemented criminal penalties for those that hired the unauthorized. That was the first change at that point. Now, really what happened was a lot of contractors and subcontractors started to appear at that time to handle the work for the large firms that were hiring some of these people, just to shield them from that. But this was the first time we saw criminal penalties for the hiring rather than against the people. Now, Clinton really tightened up things. This is called in IRA, I think is how people say it, Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. In these laws, one of the things that he said was, if you've lived here in the States for a certain length of time and you want to become a citizen and apply, you want to jump from the left to the right-hand side of that earlier chart, and you want to get on a pathway to citizen, let's say you marry somebody who's a US citizen, you cannot stay in the States while you're waiting for your visa approval. You might have to leave the country for up to 7 to 10 years.
Oh my God.
So this was quite a change. And so when people say, well, why don't they just get in line? The problem here is there is no line to get in. There's no line for anybody who lives here and works here and whose home is here and whose family is here. There's no line to get in, to jump to the citizen. You're probably very familiar with this. Why do Central Americans and Mexicans want to come to the U.S. for income? Of course, we had the Bracero program. It really peaked at about 500,000 in 1 year. mostly in agriculture in the West, but also there were people certainly throughout the nation who took advantage of the Bracero program. It was eventually canceled. I think it was a very good program apparently on paper, but it was not adhered to in the standards that were set for the living conditions and the health care that were needed to be provided to these people. And so the program was canceled, really not replaced with anything adequate. Safety, we've talked about taking refuge here and the fact that we have been a signatory to the United Nations Refugee Convention of 1951 and also mimic that language in our laws, both in the Immigration and Naturalization Act as well as the Refugee Act of 1980. And what this says is we will provide asylum for people regardless of where they ask for asylum, and the fact that, and it also says we will not detain them in any way, and we will not return them to danger. This is a big issue in the news recently, of course, is what has Trump asked to happen is that people who are crossing between our ports of entry are not allowed to ask for asylum. So that's a big question, whether he's even allowed to do that. This is a small footnote, but a big, big issue. And it's something that I wasn't as familiar with as maybe I should have been, which is my history. That the US is not only historically, but continues to this day to destabilize our Central American neighbors, both economically and politically. And I've listed the countries here, that's Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, I guess I got that twice, Cuba and Dominican Republic. So I'm sure there are other experts in the room who know a lot more about this than I do, but as I was learning and reading more, it's something that really stuck with me, that we as a nation really were not promoting strong neighbors, but we were promoting weak neighbors, and we were causing some of this northward migration based on the things that we've done. Not just economically and politically, but when we talk about the gangs that are now very prolific in some of these countries, they really started here in our jails and were exported to these countries. And so we just have to be careful about how we treat them, I think. 2 or 3 more slides. Recent changes in U.S. immigration you're familiar with. The travel ban. This is the list of countries that applies both to the visitors as well as to the citizen sides of that chart. And this was something that, as you know, bounced around the courts quite a bit and eventually got to the Supreme Court. And it was determined that President Trump did have the power and the authority to ban people from these countries based on national security. DACA is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, just came out through the Ninth Circuit and will be going to the Supreme Court at some point soon. The question is, will we be able to continue to have this program? Temporary protected status, this is a lot more information about the countries and the number of people. Basically, as I had mentioned, the temporary protected status generically was allowed by law, but then each year, it used to be Department of Justice, but then became Department of Homeland Security, and the president decided, is it still too early for people to be going home based on the problems that were there? And so there's been a lot of fights within the government right now, whether it's safe for people, say from El Salvador, to go home, or Honduras, or the Haitians. In the meantime, some of these people have been here 20 or more than 20 years, and they've had, you can see the number, 273,000 citizen children while they've been here. But Trump would like to cancel these programs, sending people home during 2019, and these are being fought, this is being fought in the courts. ICE, the zero tolerance policy, really says we're gonna criminally charge to the full extent of the law, we're gonna detain as many people as we can and deport them as fast as we can. And then there are some very interesting administrative things going on. There's now a proposal that says we should deny immigrant applications coming up through this group, which is the naturalization of the citizens group, deny them the ability to move from one kind of visa into a green card or from the green card into citizenship based on the public services that they've used. And so this has a big effect on the quality of life of people who are here and who are not full citizens. Now here's just a little bit about Arizona. Pretty much Arizona mimics the nationwide population percentages. About 7 million people live here. About 13.4 are immigrants, foreign born of all kinds. 3.4, that's about 0.1% higher than the national average, so about the national average of unauthorized residents. The courts here in Arizona are in Phoenix, Tucson, Eloy, and Florence, and that shows you the number of judges, and that's a relatively recent change. 2 years ago, it would have just been Phoenix and Tucson, so they're putting the judges close to the detention centers. This is the number of Border Patrol agents and apprehensions in 2017. So 3691 agents in the Tucson sector, which is most of Arizona, not the western strip, and over 38,000 apprehensions in all of 2017. Your detention centers, there are all kinds of detention centers. When I looked at the list, there were over 40 places where immigrants could be detained in Arizona. Not all of them are being used all the time, but this is throughout the last few years. Most of the detention centers here, the big ones, are owned and operated by the Corrections Corporation of America, which is the largest of the private facilities, and those are starred here. There are 3 in Florence and 1 in Eloy. There's one there that's owned and operated by the federal government. And 2 interesting local cooperation. Operation Stonegarden, you may have seen in the news, is local grants for equipment and personnel to support the Border Patrol. These are for border counties. And right now, Pima County is not currently taking this grant, but it's controversial. We have in the past here in this county, but we're not now. It's up for discussion. There are a lot of articles in the paper now about this, so it's something that you can definitely stay current with. And then the 287G agreements are found in a few places around Arizona as well. And this is the deputizing of the local sheriff and police in order to support ICE and immigration. So in the back, I have a handout, which is what can you do now? And I think really these are kind of the 4 main categories. You can try to learn more, which is it's always ongoing that you need to keep current and keep learning more. You can do something locally, like join this group, or there are other groups that I've listed that are also doing good work here in the area. There are, of course, lots of national and local organizations that are fighting this. The ACLU is a big one, and the Southern Poverty Law Center. There are lots of groups that at the national level are working on things like this, or you can advocate for changes. And I think probably Sarah is going to talk in her discussion about the immigration group. She's going to give you some ideas for some things you can do right here today. So I'll open it up for questions if we have time, or I'll stay after the meeting. I don't know. How are we doing in our time? We're good.
Yeah.
Shall we open it to a few questions?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Would you please tell us what the Tucson sector comprises?
Yes. Tucson is all of the state of Arizona except the very western portion. So Yuma sector comes down from Nevada, and then it straddles the border between Arizona and California. So it's only a couple hundred miles of that western part of Arizona is not included. It's the whole state. That's the Tucson sector. Mhm. Yes.
Do you know whether the apprehensions, I think you had 38,000+ for 2017, how that compares to previous years?
I have statistics here and I can show you. Yes, yes.
You might want lights.
Yeah, in fact, why don't I can give you that sheet and you can look and you can see, because you got all kinds of
Okay, great. Thank you.
statistics here, yes.
Thanks.
What about the temporary status people being sent back? Is that in the court system, or are they really sending them back?
No, they're telling them that they have to go back because their status will no longer be valid. They will have temporary status visas that will expire on a certain date. This is what Trump is saying. Now, it is already in the court, so they're saying he can't cancel the program. So what would happen if they allow him to do that is that the visas would expire and we would end up probably having a lot more people who would be unauthorized.
Now they would be unauthorized if they stayed, but they
Right.
wouldn't physically pick them up and send them back to Honduras
They
or
could,
wherever.
they certainly could. I certainly could choose to target them.
But have they?
No, they haven't yet because nothing has expired yet.
Okay.
All the expirations are coming they're coming in 2019.
Okay.
They haven't expired yet. We've just said they're going to expire, because I'm not gonna sign the paper that says I'm gonna extend this another year. Every year I sign the paper, I'm not signing this year. So we're waiting to see what's gonna happen, yes.
You mentioned that the number of asylum seekers that are here in that program is between 20 and 30,000. Is that just a squishy number, or is there a limit that Trump has placed on it?
No, there's no limit that's placed on it. It's a squishy number, that's right. It's just because we haven't really ever counted the asylum seekers before. So it's a number that has happened in the past, but we don't know there's no limit, but there could be a limit. So when they gave that 30,000 this year, part of the rationale was, hey, we're getting so many asylum requests from our southern borders that we're gonna help them and we're gonna help the refugees, but at a lower rate. So that was sort of the rationale. But there's no limit on that currently. Yes?
Could you put your very first slide up again with the history of the treaties?
Yes. This is, of course, a shortened version of.
Yes.
Mhm. Sure. Yes.
Allison, is your presentation available to us online? Do you have a place where we could go and get this stuff?
It isn't online right now. I think it's gonna be on film and it will be posted at the Alliance for Action website. Part of my problem is it's changing. This is changing so much and I'm not settled in yet. I would love for you, for example, to let me know if you have any suggestions for things that are missing, or if you know of other groups in the area who'd like to have this presentation. I'm available to come out. I'm here through February, and I would love to give this presentation at churches or libraries or book clubs, so if you have other ideas. But the best place to look for it now is on the Alliance for Action website.
And Facebook page.
And Facebook page. Thank you. Any other questions, or shall we move along? Thank you so much for paying attention.